Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video I'm going to be going over the basics of one of the best data fetching and caching library in React, and of course I'm talking about the RTK Query library. So this tutorial is specifically for those who like to use Redux as a state manager and want to learn RTK Query. We're going to be using the Redux Toolkit library, and if you want to check out the entire code for this video, it's all going to be in the description below, together with a step-by-step guide on how to clone the repository and a text version of this tutorial on my website, PedroTech.co. Before we get into the video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. This is one of the best ways you guys can support my channel. So if you guys do that, I would really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay, everyone. So let's get started with the tutorial. I have opened here a project called RTK Query 2024. I opened up a Vite application inside of my VS Code, and this application is completely empty. As you can see, it just renders the app component and renders a header tag. So in this tutorial, since we're going to be fetching data from an API, I'm using this public free API that is usually used for you to test and mock data. It's called JSON Placeholder. I use it for a lot of my videos. They have a variety of different endpoints that you can use. We're going to be using a couple of them, both a GET request and a POST request, so that we can have a range of examples for you guys. But as you can see, the project is completely empty. We're going to start directly from installing the package and continue from there. So in order to install the Redux Toolkit library, you're going to have to open up your terminal, open up another tab, and inside of here, I'm going to run npm install at reduxjs/toolkit, and then space, and I'll also install the React Redux library. So these two are two different libraries, as you might expect. Redux Toolkit is a simplified version of React Redux, or the Redux library in React. It makes Redux a way better developer experience, but you still need to have access to a lot of the core parts of the original Redux library. That's why you need to install both of them. Now that I have installed, I'm gonna just close this up, and we can start our project. The first thing I need to do is create a file in our application that is going to contain the store that we're going to be using for our project. So I'm going to create a store.js file over here. Now here is where we're going to configure our Redux store and be able to apply the different reducers that we're going to have in our application. So to start configuring our store, we have to import a very nifty function from the Redux Toolkit library, which is the configure store function. Then we also need to import another thing, but this time is from the Redux Toolkit /query package. And what we want to import is the setup listeners function. Now I'll explain what it is when we use it. Now we need to create our store. So I'm going to create a variable over here called store and set it equal to the configure store function. Here is where we're going to put and define our reducer. Now, a reducer is a function that describes how the application state changes in response to an action. In our case specifically, since we're using Redux Toolkit introduced the idea of a reducer slice. And what a reducer slice is a collection of reducer logic actions, and it is used specifically to facilitate how we define the state of our app. And since we're using RTK Query here, Redux Toolkit very easily mixes up both your state, non-API related slices and the slices that you need for fetching data from an API. So all of this configuration is very similar to how you would do it if you're not using RTK Query and is just using Redux Toolkit as a state manager for your local data. But you might notice that it will be a little bit different as we go on, because what we have to do now is define the reducer and pass in all the slices we need for this application inside of here. Now, what are we going to pass inside of here? Well, how Redux Toolkit specifically recommend is whenever we have our APIs, right, the different APIs we're going to be fetching data from, we create a specific API representative for it inside of a services folder. And then inside of here, since we are using the JSON Placeholder API, I'm going to create a file called JSON Placeholder API.js. Now this is where we're going to define the API slice for the JSON Placeholder API. If we were to have other APIs that we want to fetch data from, we would create an individual file for those as well. So what do we need to do inside of this file? Well, it's pretty simple. You can just export const JSON Placeholder API and then utilize the create API function from Redux Toolkit Query. How we define this, the arguments to this function is pretty simple. We'll have to pass first the reducer path, which will be a string name to represent our API whenever we want to get data from it. We can call it JSON Placeholder API. And then we also need to pass in a base query and utilize the fetch base query function from RTK Query. Now, what is the base query? It's just the initial base URL to the API you're using. So for example, if I grab here the API we're going to be using as an example, the base URL would be this, because if I want to grab the posts endpoint inside of this URL, it would be this and then /posts in the end, as you can see. So we just want to create a unified base URL in which all of the other routes from the API will be based on. So to pass that, I'll just pass the base URL and pass the URL as a string. Now we need to pass in the endpoints we want to have for this specific API. Now we can pass a callback function here, which is gonna give us access to this builder variable, and you return back an object containing all the different endpoints that we might want to have execution inside of this API. In this tutorial, we're just going to deal with 2 of them, even though we could technically write endpoints for each of these endpoints that this API provide for us. But we just want to deal with 2 examples, one that we fetch data and one that we mutate data. So I'm going to create an endpoint here for getting posts. So accessing this endpoint over here. So I'm going to create one called get posts, and we'll deal with whatever that does in a second. But I also want to create one called create posts. So for every single endpoint you have, you'll create a different function inside of this endpoints object. Now, let's start with the get posts, because it's the one that we're going to use to query and fetch posts. What do we do inside of here? Well, to define if you're fetching or mutating data in Redux Toolkit, you use this builder over here to specify that this get posts is a query. And we can pass here the specific query that we want to fetch. For example, if this wasn't a get posts and was a get comments, the query would be over here a query variable, and we would pass in a function that returns the comments string to represent that the endpoint in the end will be /comments. But since we are dealing with the posts, we're going to put posts over here, and this will fetch the base URL /posts. Now, one thing that is important is that if you were to be defining an endpoint that has, for example, params here, if I wanted to get a specific post by ID, this is a very common use case. I could get the ID from here. This would be accessible when we call this function later on, and I could make this become something like this, and then pass in the ID over here and turn this into JavaScript. So if you are in a scenario where you want to pass in params, this is a way you could do this, and that's why we have this callback function, so we can access this variable. But in this tutorial, we're not doing that. We're just getting all the lists of all the posts. So now that we got that out of the way, this will return whatever this endpoint returns. Let's build the mutation. So to build the mutation, I'll just say builder.mutation, and inside of here, I'm going to pass in an object similar to the query. Now, this object will be a little bit bigger. For a mutation, we'll have to define a query over here, and this query will require us to have access to the new data that we're going to pass as the body to this request, right? So we're making a post request. We need to pass body as the data that is going to be introduced to the API. So in this case, since we're making a new post, it will be the new post that we're going to be passing whenever we call this create posts function. Now, inside of this object, we have to pass three things. First, the URL. Now, the URL is going to be /posts, similar to this, but we have to specify that this is a post request, because we could have a put request for /posts, we could have a delete request for /posts, and we can have a post request for /posts. So we have to specify the specific method we want. All of those three are mutations. So we need to specify that this is a post creation mutation. Now, inside of here, we're also going to have to pass the body. And the body is going to be equal to the new post that we're trying to create. So this is the basic idea of defining your API slice. You have to pass in a reducers path, just like I said. This is just a unique key for your slice in your Redux store. We also have to pass in a base query, which, like I said, configures the base URL for all of your requests. And we also have to define the endpoints, which will be how we access the different API requests we'll have in our application. Now that we created our API slice, we want to export hooks that will allow us to make the GET requests and the POST requests. Now, this is one of the beauties of the Redux Toolkit RTK Query library. It will auto-generate hooks that we can just call in our React components, making everything a lot more easy to integrate. Now, how do I create those hooks? Well, I don't need to create them. They are auto-generated, like I said. And the way I access them is I need to export them and destructure them directly from the JSON Placeholder API that we created. Now, how do I define the hooks that we are exporting? Well, the way it is named is you first put a use, because it's a hook, and then you put the name of the operation that you want. So for the get posts, it will be a use get posts. And then you put whether it's a query or a mutation. So this is a query, I'll say query. Now for the mutation, it has to be use create posts mutation, just like this. And this will be auto-generated, and we could just import it in our components. Now that we have everything in our API slice file done, before we actually start importing them over here, we have to get back to our store.js, because we started creating it, but we never finished it because we had to create our slice first. What we have to do here is, inside of our reducer over here, we have to define our JSON Placeholder API slice inside of here. So the way we define it is we first pass in the JSON Placeholder API, and we have to actually, are we exporting it? Yes. So we have to import it over here at the top. I'll say import from /services/JSON placeholder, and I'll import the JSON Placeholder API. And over here, as the key to this object, I'm going to pass in the reducer path. And we'll set this equal to the JSON Placeholder.reducer. So it will auto-generate the reducers for us. Now, on top of that, we want to pass in a middleware. Now, why do I want to pass in a middleware? Since if you're working with Redux Toolkit and you're creating local states, you not always need to define one. Well, with the RTK Query library, it is important for you to add the API middleware because it will enable caching, invalidation, polling, and other extremely useful features that the RTK Query library has for us. So it's very simple how we define it. We can use the get default middleware argument to this function, and when we return back, we'll just use that function as the callback over here, and we'll just concat in the end the JSON placeholder API .middleware. So it auto generates the middleware for us, so we don't have to worry about it. Now, this is pretty much almost done. We just need to do one final step, which is set up the listeners that I mentioned in the beginning. What this function will allow us to do is, it is optional, but there are a lot of cool features that RTK Query has that are very similar to other really good data fetching and server state managing libraries, which is, for example, if I have an API request and it's loading data over here and I change tabs, for example, when I come back, I want to have some sort of updated version of that data. So there's functionalities like being able to refetch the data when you go back to the tab, or when you reconnect your internet connection, stuff like that, that are important to have in your application if you want to have them. And to do them, you need to set up listeners and pass in your store.dispatch. That's literally all you have to do to enable all of the cool things that I just mentioned. So now we defined our slice and our store, we're pretty much able to start using this in our application. The one last thing we want to do is tell React that where to access everything related to Redux. Now, if you've worked with any state management libraries in the past, you know what a provider is, and Redux is no different. With RTK Query, or just Redux in general, and any other state management library, there is the concept of a provider, which will allow us to define where in our app we want to have access to the states or the state management store that we have created. Now, with Redux Toolkit and RTK Query, there's two ways you can approach this. One way is if you have already created local states and you have a provider already in your application, and you created a store, which is how we're going to do it, we can import here on the top from React Redux the provider component. And what this will do is wherever in our app we wrap this component around, we'll be able to pass in the store inside of it. So I'll pass in the store and pass in the store that we created, which we can import here on the top. I'll import from /store, and then I'll just import the store. Are we not actually exporting it? Yeah, so let me export this. And now what this does is everywhere inside of this provider component, so our entire app in this case, will have access to everything inside of our store. So anything that would be outside of it wouldn't be able to access none of the hooks or none of the data that we have. Now, if you're using Redux RTK Query and you don't want to create a store, because a store usually deals with possibly having, if you're dealing with local states as well, not just server states, you might want to instead not create this whole store, just create the API slice, just have this. And if that's the case, you could also utilize the API provider from Redux Toolkit /query /react, I believe. And you can import the API provider and replace this with the API provider. And instead of passing a store, you can pass in an API over here and then pass in the specific API that you want. So the JSON Placeholder API. Now, I don't want to do that because we could possibly have multiple APIs that we have in this application. And just as an example for you guys, since most likely if you're using RTK Query, you're already using Redux Toolkit, I want to set up a store and do it just the way we have done it so far. So I'm going to be using the provider and passing in the store. Now that that's done, we're pretty much able to utilize all of the hooks and functions that RTK Query will provide for us. So let's start by getting all the posts. So utilizing the query. How do I do that? Well, first of all, let me import over here in the top from ./services/JSON Placeholder API. And let's import both hooks that we created, the query one and the mutation one, because we're going to use both of them later. Let's start with the query. I'm going to say const, and I'm going to set this equal to the use get posts query hook. And this will return back to us some really interesting information related to this query. The first thing it can return is the data, then the error, and then the is loading. What all of this will mean is the data will be a variable storing the data that we get back from this API request. The error is a variable holding any kind of error that occurs, and is loading is a boolean that tells us if the data is still fetching or not. So let's first of all deal with error and is loading. I'm going to say if the data fetching is loading, then I want to just return a p tag that will say loading, 3 dots. Perfect. So we handled that case. Now let's say if there's any error, then I just want to return a message saying there was an error. and then put a set face. Now that we're done with that, before I deal with actually getting the data, I just want to console log the data to see if everything is working. Let's see if this works. As you can see, it doesn't seem to be working. Let me open this up, the console. It says app is not defined. Did I make a mistake here? Did I accidentally delete the the app component? So let me just import over here app from app and put this back here. That was weird. I don't remember doing that. But yeah, let's grab this, refresh this. As you can see, it seems that it's saying that useGetPostQuery is not a function. Now, I've seen this error before, and I know exactly what it is. It was probably a misimport. So if you guys also dealt with this, yeah, it was definitely a misimport. Sometimes when I import this, it will import from Toolkit Query, but I want to import from query/react. And as you can see, it immediately works. I think I'm going to leave this in because I know a lot of people will deal with this error as well. But now that we changed this import, it should actually console log the data. And yes, it does console log the data. As you can see, it's an array and it has all the data from the API. Nice. So let's display the data. As you can see, for each post, there's a body and there's a title. So I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to access those two pieces of data. Let's just come down here and let's create a div. And this div will have a map that is going to loop through the data from the API request. And whenever it maps, I want to grab the post from it. And actually, let's just return, to for simplicity reasons, the post.title. Perfect. Let me refresh this, and you can see we correctly fetched the data and displayed everything in the screen. Now, this is the easy part. You see, for a second, it also loads. There's no errors. Now, how do we deal with the mutation, right? The use create post mutation. Well, it's not that different, to be honest. We're going to copy this over here and paste it here. I'm going to change this to use create post mutation. Now, for the mutation, it's a bit different because we're not going to use this. We're going to have to also turn this into square brackets, and it's going to return a function first. And this function is going to be the function that is going to be called whenever we want to execute the mutation. Now, what we get back from it is all of that information, like if the data is loading and so on. So I can destructure the is loading from here and the error from here. Now, since we have both errors and is loading already set up, I want to change this to is creating and this to create error. And we want to check to see if the, actually I'm gonna use that later, but I'm gonna say if error, or if create error, sorry, if create error, then I want to return a message saying there was an error creating a post. And down here, actually above this, I want to create a simple form-like structure where I'm going to have an input for creating the, and I'll say type text, for creating the title. So we'll say placeholder, title, 3 dots, and we'll have one as well for the body. So let's say body and 3 dots. Perfect. Now we have both of them over here. Let's create a button as well. And let's say create post. Now let's create a state over here that is going to hold the information for what we're typing. So I'm going to say new post and set new post. This will be a state for, it will be an object, and the object will look like this. It will have a title, which will start as empty. It will have a body, which will start as empty. And for simplicity reasons for this video, I'm going to create every new post is just going to have an ID of 999 or 9099. And then in the inputs over here, I'm going to pass an onChange that is going to have an event. And I'm just going to set the new post equal to, and then I need to change in the object inside of new post, I need to change only the field for the title in this case. So I'm going to grab the previous value, which is going to be the current object, and I'm going to return back the object exactly the same, but the title field is going to change to be equal to the event.target.value. So I'm just technically changing the title field in the new post state. And we'll do the same thing for the body input over here as well, but we'll change the body. Now the ID is going to remain the same, so everything's fine. And what we can do now is create a function for handling creating posts. So handle create post. And this function has to be asynchronous because we're going to have an async await. And inside of here, whenever this function is called, I just want to await a create post, and inside of here, I'll just pass the new post object or state that we have. It defaulted to create error. Let's actually use create post. Now let's pass the handle create post to this button. So on click, I'll pass the handle create post, and just so we have a use case as well for the is loading or the is creating, let's make it such that when we click the button and it's loading the mutation, we want to disable the create post so that you're not able to create a post twice. So we'll say that it is creating. So let's see what happens here. I don't know if this will have, with the JSON placeholder, I'm not running this API. I just know that they also accept mutations or post requests. And it's just for testing. So I'm going to try over here. I'm going to say a title for a post is going to be Pedro, and the body is going to be body of the post. Let's open up the network tab just to check to see if the actual post request is going to work. And I'm going to click create post. You see that for a second, the create post button disabled, and then it enabled again, meaning that we successfully made the request. And you see that the post request was successful. The response was 200. The ID, I just noticed they gave a random ID, so I didn't even have to specify that, which is good. But yeah, the post was created. I don't think we'll see it over here in this data. Because this data, I don't think they would allow us to actually insert data into this API. But you see, this is how we create post requests using RTK Query. And this is basically it for the video, or at least this part of the video. The last thing I want to talk about is how cache interacts and works in RTK Query. Because RTK Query, similar to React Query, is indeed a data fetching library in a way, but it's also more of a library that helps you manage the states in your server. But not only that, it's also a caching library. It has a lot of different aspects to it that makes it really interesting. And caching in RTK Query is extremely powerful. The cache in the library is designed to improve the performance, like many other libraries, by just avoiding unnecessary network requests. And how it behaves in RTK Query is by basically when you define your endpoints in your API. So here, when we define the endpoints, right, the data is cached according to each endpoint definition. Now, one also cool thing is that the data that is cached remains cached as long as at least one component in your application is subscribed to that data. So if we have one component that is accessing the get posts here, and that component is unmounted, then the data won't be cached anymore because that information is no longer needed. So how would it behave in an actual component? Well, imagine this use get posts query over here. If two components need this data in our application, and both of them are fetching the same data, right? They're both fetching the posts data. RTK Query will only fetch it once, will only make one network request, and it will cache it. So you'll save some network requests because of that. Also, if no components are subscribed to a specific query, the cache will actually expire after a specific time that you put. The default time is 60 seconds, but if I wanted to change that to be something lower or higher, I can change based on the API or based on the individual endpoint. For example, if I want to change this based on the API, I could actually come over here above the endpoints and I could set a keep unused data for, and I could put something like 20 seconds. And what this will do is the cache will expire if this data is not being used anywhere in your React app after 20 seconds. Now, if you want to specify even like in a more specific manner, if you want to specify per endpoint, you can do that as well. For example, when we say the builder query over here, after I define the query, I could specify the same property and put like 5 seconds if I wanted to. Now, there's multiple reasons why you might want to be more specific, but this is a pretty cool tool and it's really easy to set up in your application. Now, one cool feature that other libraries such as RTK Query, similar libraries like React Query has, that RTK Query also has, is the ability to refetch a query. And how we can set that up is, for example, if I have this get post query and I want to manually refetch this query, I could just use the refetch function that comes destructured from this. And for example, if I wanted to refetch after I create a post, I could put that over here. And now you'll see that whenever I create a new post, like for example, I'll create the same post before, and you'll see that now not only it makes the post request for creating, but it also refetches the data. And again, I don't think it will actually show the data that I just created. But as you can see, you can manually refetch the data, which can help you achieve the complete granular control over this operation. Now, one last thing I wanted to show you guys is, remember when we set up the setup listeners over here? Now, we aren't really seeing anything being done. But one thing we can do to actually see that in action is, for example, if I wanted to set up the property to refetch this API request whenever the user focuses on the window, right? So whenever the user changes window and they come back over here, the data might be outdated. So you might want to refetch that data. You can do that by above your base query over here, similar to how we did the last property. We can just set up the refetch on focus and set it equal to true. And now what this will do is we'll keep the network request over here open. You see, if I do it once, there's one network request. Now let me come here and let me go back. You should see that there's another because it refetched the data, and we'll keep refetching the data as long as we are leaving this. And this is good because, I mean, if I'm doing it like this, it seems like I'm unnecessarily calling data. But what happens a lot of times is that users might leave this website, go back here, do a bunch of stuff like keep opening new tabs and doing stuff, and then they will go back, and then like hours later or days later, and the data should be updated, right? So yeah, that's basically it. That's everything I wanted to talk about. If you want to check out the code for this video, it will all be in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week, and I have amazing videos coming out. Really excited to post them. And yeah, that's basically it. Really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.